During the early 20th century, inter-service rivalry in Japan was a touchy subject, one that became a real problem as the Army and Navy absolutely loathed each other. One lesser-known side of this was the parallel navy that the Japanese Army built up, although calling it a navy is being a tad generous. This wasn't Army-operated battleships or destroyers, although it did include submarines. And the topic of today's video, which you could be forgiven for thinking, was an aircraft carrier. Akitsu Maru was not, however, an aircraft carrier. This ship was, if anything, more of a prototype for modern amphibious assault ships, right down to looking like one, at least to some extent. So while you'll sometimes see the ship listed as an escort carrier, that's not really accurate. But we'll get to that. First, let's look at how her story began. And that was as an ocean liner on September 17th, 1939. Or alternatively, in November of the same year. Sources differ on this topic. Either way, the ship that would become Akitsu Maru was laid down in late 1939, although she would never complete in her original design, because in June of 1941, the incomplete hull was requisitioned by the Imperial Japanese Army. They promptly set about converting the ship into a new design, typically called a landing craft depot ship, which does describe the role well, because Akitsu Maru, as converted, was intended to operate landing craft, to carry them, launch them, and support landing operations, as well as use her aircraft to further support troops ashore, or as a ferry. This was a forward-thinking role, to say the least. However, it was not the first time the Japanese did it. That was Shenshu Maru, which is an interesting design in its own right. However, that's a topic for a different video. For now, let's look at the design of Akitsu Maru. The ship displaced around 11,800 tons at her standard loading. I haven't found a source on the full displacement, although it probably rose by a couple thousand tons. That compared favorably to the 7,000 to 8,000 ton displacement of Shenshu Maru. This on a length of 471 feet or 143 meters. On that displacement, Akitsu Maru could carry an eclectic mix of equipment. In her landing craft support role, the ship operated between 20 to 30 landing craft. The exact number, again, varies between sources, as does how they would be launched. You'll see reference, including in paintings, of a stern door for this purpose. However, diagrams typically don't show this. In any case, those would have been the Daihatsu type, roughly 14 meters or 47 feet long and displacing around 20 tons. So decently large landing craft for the time period. This design is probably familiar to anyone who played Battlefield 1942. And as I date myself with that reference, let's move on. In addition to the landing craft, Akitsu Maru also carried aircraft. This was not in traditional carrier style, however. The ship lacked a proper hangar as such. Akitsu Maru carried an air wing of just 8 aircraft. Those planes would have been designs with a slow takeoff and landing speed, as the ship lacked arrestor gear to recover her planes, although some sources will say she was fitted with arresting gear in a later refit, and the same goes for an elevator at the stern. We'll return to that later. As for the planes, these were Kokusai Ki-76, a high-wing spotter and liaison aircraft akin to the far more famous German Storch. Akitsu Maru could, theoretically, operate more powerful aircraft as well, provided it was just flying them off to land at air bases ashore. In that ferry role, the ship could carry up to 30 aircraft. Akitsu Maru also carried autogyros at various points in her career. Combined Fleet cites 2 modified Kayaba Ka-1s. modified and using the forward cockpit to carry 2 small depth charges. I distinctly remember an old History Channel documentary, and I use the word documentary very loosely here, that hyped up Akitsu Maru as a war-winning weapon. Good old History Channel. Regardless, there is footage of the ship landing and testing the KA-1, so those were, at very bare minimum, tested aboard the ship. As for organic weaponry, the ship carried 2 75mm or 3-inch anti-aircraft guns, along with 10 75mm field guns as the secondary battery. Some sources will also note the ubiquitous 25mm gun as well. The exact number is harder to say. Photographic evidence is lacking for this ship. There's 2 of them mounted here, but that doesn't say much. I haven't found good pictures to say beyond this. The upper number is, as a result, a bit of a mystery. With that out of the way, though, we've reached the end of the technical bits. Just the speed left to look at, which came out to 20 knots on 7,500 shaft horsepower, through 2 shafts. That was a lot of talk on design and background, but that's because this is a special ship, and because the service history is, well, there's not much to talk about there. Akitsu Maru was launched on September 24th of 1941, and completed on January 30th, 1942, fairly early into the Pacific War, to be fair, which allowed the ship to sail south in February to join the invasion of Java, where she arrived on March 1st, 1942, to unload troops from the Japanese 2nd Infantry Division. This went without issue, unlike her predecessor, Shinshu Maru, which was torpedoed by Mogami on March 1st at the Battle of the Sunda Strait. In any case, Akitsu Maru would spend much of 1942 on transport duty, as could be expected with her design and the distinct lack of amphibious operations after the East Indies fell. This would see her sail between Singapore, Manchuria, and Japan. It wouldn't be until late September that the ship sailed farther afield, in this case to Wake Island, arriving there on September 30th, before leaving a couple days later, on October 3rd, to sail for Truk. Akitsu Maru arrived at Japan's island Bastion on October 7th, before leaving again on the 10th, at which point it was back to transport runs between Japan and the South Pacific. The rest of the year would see her make trips between Truk, Japan, and Rabaul, with the ship moored at Truk on January 1st, 1943. And 1943 would follow pretty much the same pattern. A ton of transport and ferry runs across Japan's overstretched empire. There's not really much to say about her service for most of that year. It would just be listing off a bunch of dates and locations. Until, that is, November 18th. Nearing the end of 1943, Akitsu Maru was on another transport run. This saw her depart Manila Bay, escorted by the torpedo boat Tomozuru. Yes, the same ship from the infamous Tomozuru incident. Those ships were sighted off Manila by an American submarine soon after their departure. That boat fired off 6 Mark 14 torpedoes, all directed at Akitsu Maru, which either missed entirely or were duds. Fairly typical performance for the Mark 14, although the end of 1943 is surprisingly late for those problems. Regardless, Akitsu Maru continued on her way. She would be part of a convoy attacked by B-25s off China on November 27th, although the Army ship once more escaped any damage, and she would end off 1943 in Japanese home waters, which led into the same duties in 1944. As I said, not much of note here. From January through April, it was more of the same transport runs. Where things get a bit more interesting is in April, specifically April 13th, where Combined Fleet cites her as going in for a refit. A refit specifically to expand the flight deck. This coincides with Japanese warships, which claims her flight deck was modified in May of 1944 to permit aircraft to land. The exact extent of this refit is interesting. You only see pictures of the ship from 1944, so it's hard to say what she looked like before then. Japanese warships notes the installation of a large barrack structure, making landings impractical in the original design. With that 1944 refit to modify the deck and make it possible for aircraft to land. Combined Fleet, meanwhile, notes the flight deck being modified to support the air wing, complete with an elevator at the stern, which you can see on Japanese warships' diagram in this picture. Combined Fleet also says that the bridge and funnel were moved to starboard at this point, but everything I've read about the ship says she was converted with a flying off deck, and already looked mostly like a carrier from the start of her Army service. So I'm more doubtful about that modification, but again, there don't seem to be any photos before 1944. At least not that I can find, so make of that what you will. Either way, the ship came out of this refit on July 30th, 1944. She may have spent August on anti-submarine patrol, although this is difficult to say. The same goes for September and November, with Combined Fleet noting her aircraft probably conducted anti-submarine patrols. Regardless of if that's the case or not, it wouldn't save the ship. Akitsu Maru departed on her final transport run on November 14th of 1944, loaded up with men and material for the Philippines, including aircraft and depth charges for explosive motorboats. The latter would prove deadly, but not to the enemy. On November 15th in the Korean Strait, Akitsu Maru's convoy was spotted by a submarine. USS Queenfish maneuvered into position and fired 4 torpedoes from her stern tubes. 2 hit Akitsu Maru, with 1 setting off her depth charges. This shattered the ship's stern, opening her boilers to the ocean. When water reached those, they exploded as well. This was more than enough damage to sink the ship. Within 3 minutes, Akitsu Maru capsized to port and went under. 67 of the crew, 140 gunners, and 2,093 Army soldiers went down with the ship. Although you'll see a smaller number, 2,046 in all, also sighted. 310 survivors were pulled from the water. USS Queenfish would escape, while the convoy continued on to safety. Akitsu Maru's story isn't the most exciting, but that isn't surprising. Not for a ship used mostly as a transport, breathless old documentaries aside. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.